Tim, thank you so much for making the time to chat to me this week, mate. I really appreciate it. I know you're incredibly busy, and I know that this is also a subject that is incredibly emotionally charged and very divisive. But the purpose of speaking to you today is to really strip this discussion of any emotion and just look at the challenges that lay ahead, both in the future and the current landscape for sport and law with the inclusion of transgender athletes. Just how challenging has this been for sport and law to address?
Oh, Luce, without a doubt, very challenging because it's an emerging area within the law of discrimination. So historically, when it comes to discrimination in sport, we've had race, sex, and this fits into sex discrimination. We've had challenges around disability, but this is a new area, like transgendered athletes within sport. Well, when I say new, at least from a sort of a framework, a rule framework perspective, like we've always had, people who have attempted to compete based on sex, gender, but this is really something that's a part of our society. It's a growing part of our society with trans individuals, and it's obviously crept into sport. And so for sport, with their rule frameworks, it's a new area.
And I feel as though a lot of the global governing bodies, in addition to here in Australia, the national governing bodies have faced a lot of difficulties in reaching a consensus, particularly when you look at what's happened with World Netball and now Netball Australia here choosing to go a different way. Are we ever going to reach a consensus on this, Tim? Because we have to combine so many things in this complex issue. We have to look at the law, we have to look at the ethics, we have to look at the values that underpin sport. I mean, and science. There's so much to marry up here. Can we ever reach a consensus?
Well, I don't think we will actually, Lucy, to be honest, because one of the big challenges is obviously, when you talk about like world bodies, in particular the IOC, they have put, very much the onus back on individual sport to come up with their own rules, their own policies. The problem with that is that, we've seen, particularly within women's sport, the ability of athletes to transition from sport A to sport B fairly seamlessly. So if we talk about our own country, we've had netballers that have played in the AFLW. We've had international footballers who have played for the Matildas who've gone on to play, for Australia in sports like, for example, compete in athletics, or surfing, whatever it might be. So the transition of athletes from sport A to sport B is a lot easier. Now there lies the problem. A set of policies in one sport may be completely different in another sport in this area.
So when we look at the laws that are sort of being applied here and the policies that, say, for example, sporting bodies in the country like Football Australia are relying on, they're looking to the Australian Human Rights Commission for advice on this and leaning very heavily on that. When I've contacted them in the last couple of weeks to sort of get more clarity around what their position is on this, because they are working as of last year. We haven't seen any further announcements made on that, but as of last year, working on a gender and inclusion policy with respect to transgender athletes. But they're looking to the law on this. What does the law say about it? And particularly when you look at it through the lens of the Sex Discrimination Act, which, it talks a lot about the fact that in any competitive sporting activity in which the strength, stamina, or physique of competitors is relevant, that's something that a lot are using to rely on. But then it goes further, Tim, and it talks about the objective of the exemption is to restrict competitive sporting activity to people who can effectively compete with one another. This is intended to recognise that biological differences between men and women are relevant to competitive sporting activities. It can be understood as ensuring a level playing field. So how do we look at it through the lens of this, really?
Yeah, look, you've summed that up really well. The objective of the exemption is to restrict, competitive sporting activity to people who can only effectively compete with each other. The problem with that exemption, that permanent exemption under the Act, is that, terms such as, for example, strength, stamina, physique, they're not defined within the Act. And this is where the problem, lies in relation to like trans athletes. I mean, ultimately, we've had rules that are based on characteristics of, for example, strength, physique, stamina, and that was in relation to testosterone testing. Okay, but in the actual legislation, those definitions are not set out, so it becomes a very sort of subjective, test and analysis as to whether that exemption will apply, based on those particular characteristics. So that's a hard thing to do. What's happened historically, athletes have been challenged, for example, exemptions, through things like administrative tribunals and even through to the courts. I think we'll probably see more of that ongoing because the law needs to be, if you like, in relation to this area in sport, more tightly construed.
Here in Australia, yes. I want to talk about the roles, however, though, Tim, of sporting bodies like the Australian Sports Commission, as well as Sport Integrity Australia. I know that Sport Integrity Australia deal a lot with anti-doping, etc., and I know that that's a field, particularly with respect to that very high-profile case concerning Shayna Jack that you worked on. And I know that they sort of, deal very much so in that space. But one of the things that I'm finding really challenging is when we look at some of the core values that underpin sport, so much of it concerns protecting the safety of all participants. Now, what obligations under the law do organisations like Sport Integrity Australia and the Australian Sports Commission have to protect biological females in this space? Do they have any?
Well, look, they do because the foundation of Sports Integrity Australia as a statutory authority, is to ensure that sport and integrity, are intertwined. Like that no sport, whether it's to do with, like you mentioned before, doping, or whether it's to do with match fixing, whether it's to do with gaming, whatever it might be, whether it's to do with selection, in the end, they are about ensuring that sport acts and operates, in the most integrable way. I mean, that gives us confidence in sport, doesn't it? When we've got sport that's like, bound by rules or principles like that. So that's their overarching, charter, if you like. As to how they can, bind sports, well, it's not so much. Look, they can do it through legislation. That's obviously in relation to the act that they, are bound by. But they've also have done, other things such as, for example, they've implemented the National Integrity Framework, and I think we've now seen something like 80 of our sports that have basically signed up to that or are utilising that, which is great. Now, interestingly enough, that doesn't necessarily involve our professional sports. So, our professional sports obviously being, self-sufficient and not relying necessarily on, government funding. We're talking about the AFL, the NRL, our biggest sports. Ultimately, as to whether those sports are, bound by a framework like that, that's not necessarily the case because they operate under, private rules or private contract. So, it's again an example of where there can be, differences and, different standards applied to our different sports in our country. And that's something we don't really want. We really want to try and get uniformity, don't we, across all of our sports, professional, Olympic sports, community orientated sports.
So how much damage, Tim, is it doing that we have so many different sporting organisations going one way versus the other? It's producing so many grey areas for everyone involved. You've got sporting organisations, again, as I've referenced already, like Football Australia, that from my perspective personally, I'm not drawing you into this conversation, but I feel that they are acting very weak and not showing enough leadership and almost letting the other sports do the heavy lifting on this and looking to sort of see where the cards fall on it. But how much damage is it doing that we don't have uniformity across the board here?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Lucy, because you referred before to the Australian Human Rights Commission, and one of the sports that's been of big concern in Australia, around the world for that matter, has been gymnastics. So, we've had like basic investigations into systemic, sexual misconduct and abuse in gymnastics in the United States, in the UK, and also in Australia, and who undertook, essentially that independent review of gymnastics, it was the Australian Human Rights Commission. So you're right. It's an example of a body that's not Sports Integrity Australia undertaking an investigation. Then you just referred to one of our most popular sports participation-wise in this country, and the governing body sitting on their hands, as there's been a number of concerning situations, particularly in New South Wales, and not taking the lead on that, leaving really that particular dilemma and any potential solution with the state-based body, or even potentially like the various areas, for example, divisions. So yeah, it's really unsatisfactory. We need leadership from the top. In a sport like in a country like ours, really that needs to come from, I think, the federal government, undoubtedly.
So that was going to be my next question as we look to close. Because of all of the divisiveness and I guess the incongruence around the development of policies and the International Olympics committee essentially leaving it up to everybody else to decide what it is that they want to take a stand on in this, if they want to include transgender athletes or if they don't. How do we reach a resolution, Tim? Because I feel as though we are looking to sporting bodies and they're failing. We're looking to the Australian government and they're failing. So what avenues do those like myself, who feel quite strongly about this, and particularly biological athletes who have dedicated their lives in this space to becoming the best that they can in their fields, and that extends not only to them, by the way, but to young girls right down to the community level, for which we don't have protections for. How do we reach a point where we have protections for those people put in place? Is it going to take a legislative change? Is it going to take governing bodies all uniting together? What is it going to take?
Yeah, I think it is going to take legislative change, Lisa, because unfortunately, for some reason in sport, we're always slow to act. It's for example, whenever something, well, I should clarify that we're slow to act when it comes to things off the sporting field. When things happen on the sporting field, it's amazing how sport can get its act together and very quickly, change the rules, or, bring in policies like whether it's, removing players from the field because of blood, or putting protection on posts. We tend to do things pretty quickly, when things are going wrong on the sporting field. If there's lots and lots of head knocks, we bring in concussion protocols. Off the field, when it comes to governance, we're a little bit slower to act. And at the moment, I think you've identified this really well. We are just basically, sort of like muddling around at the moment. No progress has been made. Now, one of the reasons why there's been state-based legislation in the United States, we referred to, one particular act, and that's, basically keeping women's sport, safe, is because of the number of incidences that have happened, on the sporting field. So obviously got a bigger sporting environment there, a bigger country, but, we've had players, sports like field hockey, who've had their teeth knocked out, by a trans athlete. We've had volleyball players in the United States where they've suffered serious injury when a trans player has spiked the ball, into her head and has rendered the athlete, unconscious. These are sort of incidences that then you start to see sport, take action. But we should not be waiting for that moment or that incident in Australia before we need to get on our bike now. The federal government needs to take, a lead on this, and, not get to that stage where we're starting to see injury to, female athletes from trans athletes. And look, just to sort of clarify that, nobody's suggesting that's intentional. Nobody's suggesting that's deliberate. Like, if you commit a deliberate breach of the rules in the sporting field, there are, sanctions, there are measures for removing that player. But it's just a fact that there have been a number of serious injuries suffered by, female athletes from trans athletes in the States. And that is going to happen when there's, there's no regulation. So in the States, look, there's been obviously state legislation, there's been intervention by or appeals heard in court, at the federal level. They're very active in this space, and we're almost seeing legal action and legal claims and so forth, on a weekly basis, United States. We should not get to that stage. Our government should act. And if it requires, to basically, use a heavy stick, so to speak, like they did with anti-doping as an example, they need to do so. So just as an example that the AFL initially weren't a signatory to the World Anti-Doping Code, ultimately that they did, even though they have private policy in relation to certain areas like illicit drugs. We've sort of seen a lot of that in the news lately. Ultimately, the AFL signed up to the World Anti-Doping Code. NRL did as well, and so forth. That's the approach the government's got to take. If it takes a heavy-handed approach to bring all of our sports, professional, non-professional, into line, then they need to do so because this is a very concerning area for parents, and for female athletes, undoubtedly.
Final question for you, and I know it's a challenging one, and I think you've answered a lot of sort of what I was thinking about there, particularly with respect to the safety of it all. Yep. Whichever consensus we reach, if it does take the government to get, as you said, a heavy stick out and to create some hard-hitting legislation on this to address the issues, are we ever going to make everybody happy? Is there a perfect solution here, Tim?
There's not a perfect solution, and I don't think we'll make everybody happy. But, the pathways that World Aquatics have set out in relation to open categories and so forth, really, that is probably going to be, the next best solution that we're going to get to. I mean, like there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's an open category that's not just based on trans athletes. It's an open category. So basically it caters for, like a number of differences, if you like, for want of a better word. What is sport all about? It's about competing. It's about obviously having fun. It's about getting fitness and so forth. If the only objective of trans, athletes, just to be really, really honest about this, is to compete against, females within the sport, then you've got to call that, into question. The open category characterisation, I don't see an issue with that. And I think that what World Aquatics has done is responsible. It's providing options there for, trans athletes. As you point out, there's probably going to be, there's objections to that category as well, based on, certain sort of grounds. So, but I think that's probably the best way to get, Lucy, to be honest, like, creating that category, providing options for competition. But yeah, probably won't get that perfect solution for everyone, will we?
No, we won't. But it has been a joy to speak to you, Tim. Thank you so much. Your continued work as a special counsel for Gadens has always been outstanding, and I'm so grateful for your time. I know how busy you are, so thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks, Lucy.